Okay, I just want to let everybody know that I think I'm recording.
Show's recording.
Okay, good. Um, I'm Sylvia Rath. I'm going to spotlight myself for a minute. I'm from Little Village Nursery School, and I want to thank Terry and Ruth from La Playa, who helped co-sponsor this, and Shadi from Beverly Glen Playgroup. And for our guest, Bonnie Bruce of Chauncey and Bruce Educational Resources, who has been doing assessments and recommendations for children since the 1980s and has a wonderful reputation. I heard about her through my director support group, who said, you got to get her. And that you do a great kindergarten readiness workshop. And I know even from the start of preschool, parents are always wondering about how it's going to go, and they've heard our blurb about coming to our developmental programs and that children learn through play, but still they worry, is my kid going to be ready for kindergarten? So Bonnie's going to speak to that tonight, and I'm going to give it to Bonnie now.
Thank you. Well, it really is a pleasure to be here and to share with you my experience over really well over 53 years in the field of education. Long before we had a field called early childhood education, I actually had to do my bachelor's degree work in this area in the field of home economics. That's where it was located at our college. And so that's what my bachelor's degree is, in human development and family studies. My master's degree is in early childhood special education. And I did spend years working actually within the public school system, helping to set up early childhood programs. And how does that look when we need, a child needs to have something strengthened or needs special programming rather than just what happens when we are in preschool. They need more directed attention. And so I have that as in my background. My doctoral work's all in testing and assessment. And in 1984, Chancey and Bruce incorporated as a way to work with preschools, because we felt that so much of the message that we had to share needed to be with preschool parents, because these are the foundational years. These years are so important. And so often parents think, well, we'll get in school and then whatever happens, happens. But in reality, it's what we're doing right now. And so the handouts that I'm going to be talking about, you all will be able to get a copy of them. Sylvia has them. And I don't want you to feel you've got to take copious notes. You will get everything that I'm going to be talking about. I think it's important, those of us that work in the field, to really let everybody know what we believe in. And whether you call it a mission statement, whether you call it a belief statement, I'm just a big believer that you need to know where I'm coming from. And so I'd like to just share with you what I feel is important that you know about this field. First of all, early childhood is birth to age 8. So many times parents and even some educators try to say that it ends at age 4. The minute you get ready to go into kindergarten, you're no longer a part of that early childhood. But in reality, when we look at how the brain grows and develops and what it is we need to know about that growth and development, we know how important it is that we look at the birth to age 8 as early childhood. And these are the critical years for really developing self-worth. And so you can see here that we want to enhance that environment. And it's important that we all realize that, yes, there's age appropriate and developmental appropriate opportunities for children in the home, but also as well as in the school. So as parents, we really are our children's primary teacher forever. I have 3 children of my own, and they're in their 50s, and I will tell you, it never ends, and it shouldn't end. We're always there, learning and growing together, and it's important that we understand that children need to progress at their own pace. That you were talking about the workbooks and the worksheets, and so often parents think if I get through level 1, 2, and 3, I've done my child a favor. But in fact, there are styles of learning that children need to find out how that's going to affect them. And they do that through the process of play, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think that what we have to realize that there is a sequence the way children grow and develop. We just don't all of a sudden start to walk and then we're jumping rope. That there are developmental milestones that we hit along the way. And I'm going to be talking about those milestones as we go further tonight's workshop. I think it's also important that we realize that we're not just talking about a child's intellectual growth, but we're talking physical growth, emotional growth, and social growth, and we're talking about the whole child. So often parents say to me, well, as long as they can do their ABCs and they can learn their shapes and they learn their colors, that's all that's important. But in reality, I would tell you I put more weight on the social emotional growth than I really do the academic growth in terms of how I'm going to feel about myself in the classroom. I've listed for you, and I'm not going to go through every one of these, but I think it's important that we understand play. And what I've learned along the way is that when I just used the word play very early on when I was giving workshops, that parents got the idea that I meant, oh, we're just going to let children go, helter skelter, do whatever, what doesn't matter, until I added the word educational play. And I think that's an important thrust, because what it is we do in our preschool settings and our home settings should be pretty, sometimes not just that I'm going to let children run around the house and climb up here and climb over there, but there is some things that we do that are intentional in our play and how we set the setting for things that children can choose from. And so often I also find that for a while parents were thinking, well, if I just turn on educational TV and make sure my child gets so much time in front of the TV, that will do. And what we found is that that's not how children learn. Children learn by doing, by interacting, by using their senses, what they were born with. So as you take a look, I do ask you when you get your copy, take a look at these points that we have here, 16 points about why early childhood play is so important. And when I go in, and oftentimes I'm asked to come in and evaluate programming, what I'm looking for is how do I see the children in play? How do they have free choice? How do they interact? But it is important that I don't see the workbooks coming out, or I have to sit in this chair for a certain amount of time. I'll never forget the time I was giving a workshop and I had this young gentleman come up and he said, oh, I want you to come and see my program. I'm doing a really good job and I'm really excited about it. And I walked in and I almost had to take a deep breath, because his idea of us working with young children was for the first 15 minutes, we're going to do this.
Sylvia sent out a link
next
to this
15 minutes, we're going to do this worksheet. And then
kindergarten readiness
we're going to do
Zoom.
this worksheet. And so what I find is that it's important that we understand what we mean about how the brain grows and how the brain develops. The way I'd like to present this tonight is I'm going to be looking at what we call the pathways to learning. And the pathways to learning are what it affects the brain that has been growing since the minute we've been born. And so I'm going to take you through the way the brain grows and develops. I'm going to name those areas for you. And then what I'm going to do is talk to you about right now, if you have a child who's what I call age eligible to go to kindergarten next year, where should they be in those areas? What should we be looking at? And how do we do that from a developmental standpoint? And so we know that brain connections are made through concrete experiences, how important that word concrete experiences is. And that if we try to push formal learning before the brain is ready for that, we might feel like we're successful, but in fact, what we're doing is more harm than good, because the whole brain needs to develop for the child to really be able to move forward, particularly in the area as we move into more abstract thinking. And so what we found is that when I was working in kindergarten programs, we were finding that particularly, this was before the state moved that cutoff date to September 1, we were finding that a lot of our younger children weren't quite ready for the program. But the teacher would say, well, they can catch up in first grade. And then we'd look at those same children in first grade and they'd say, well, maybe they can catch up in second grade. And then before you knew it, we were behind in a lot of areas. So what I'm going to talk to you tonight is about what we find that base needs to be now that the state has moved to a September 1 cutoff. Now that the classrooms reflect more of your 6-year-olds, children turning 6 than just turning 5. And what we found is that once the state did that, and we were very much in support of that, changing that cutoff date. However, what we found was kindergarten programs didn't stay the way they should have stayed. That what happened was they began to push down and the requirements and what the state sets as benchmarks. And where we saw the biggest push down was in the area of math, moving too quickly into abstract without children having that foundation. So when I talk to you this evening, I'm going to be talking to you about what we need to have in processing skills, but also sometimes what can be important if a child needs more time before they start that program. We call that the bonus year. We don't necessarily call that, oh, I'm going to do another year in preschool. No, you're going to have another year to play, and that's an important piece of what the brain really wants and what the brain really likes. So we're going to start with the brain and what we call pathways to learning, and I'm going to start at the back part of the brain here. This is called the cerebellum. And this is where we develop what we call our motor skills. And we like to say that we first learn to move, and we first learn to how to move, and then we move to learn. So it's important that we understand how important it is that children not necessarily have to be in ballet classes or signed up for every sport class there is, but that they have the opportunity to move in space. So when we look at children in this area, what we're looking more at is how are they with balance? How are they with walking forward and walking backward? Are they comfortable hopping or moving to move that body forward? If they put 2 feet together, can they jump forward and feel comfortable? Can they play with bean bags and catch balls? Not necessarily a defined type of space. I'm always reminded of a soccer game that I was at once, and it was a 5-year-old group of children. And the coach was a dad, and he couldn't have been nicer. He's walking up and down beside the children. He's saying to them, stay in your position, stay in your position, stay in your position. And all of a sudden, this little 5-year-old little guy walks across the field, and he starts walking with the coach and didn't miss a cadence. He said, what's up position? What's up position? And everybody just thought that was great. The laughter was very, very good because everybody realized that we've got to realize these children aren't necessarily there to stay in a position. A lot of times they're there for those snacks and for being with their friends. My other good story here that I happened to be at was I went to see a soccer game where my nephew was playing. This is many years ago. And the game was almost over. The score was 0-0. And all of a sudden, both teams of all the players got down on the ground and they started crawling around. And I jokingly said, you guys play soccer different here than we do in California, just sort of as a joke. And the time ran out and everybody was yelling, go get the ball, because there the soccer ball sat. Well, as the kids started walking off the field, I overheard one of the mothers say to the child, what were you guys doing? Didn't you see that ball right there? You could have won the game. You just had to take it. And the little boy looked at her like, well, Mom, see that boy over there? He lost his tooth. We were helping him find it in the grass. So children know what's important. Trust me on that. And so we want to make sure that as we talk about these areas, that you realize how important it is. And so moving in space means being outside, having the opportunity to run, to jump, to climb, to play with beanbags, to play with balls, so that they're comfortable with this, what we call these large motor muscles and how they develop. We also know that out of large muscle comes what we call the fine motor muscle. And the fine motor muscle is, what do I do with my hand? My eye and my hand have to work together, but I've got to build the strength and the dexterity of the hand. So often I find that parents just can't wait to get that pencil in the child's hand, and then they try to get them to write their name, and they make little dots so the child can trace the dots, or they try to get the child to move that pencil around. And oftentimes children who aren't ready to hold that pencil will pick it up with that fist grasp, like that. And we know that children at this time, if they don't build the strength and the dexterity of the hand, they don't want to drop that tool. But we also know that if they begin to get comfortable with that fist grasp, they will carry that through, and it becomes very inefficient for them. So what we say to you is, we want to see children do lots of things with Play-Doh. We want to see lots of finger plays. We want to put nuts and bolts together and take them apart. We want to string beads. We want to use those fingers. We want to build that strength and dexterity so that as we move into that 4.5-year-old level, and I begin to look at what the eye and the hand are doing together, I want to see what your child does is that they have to begin to trace a line, begin to trace it vertical and horizontal. And then at this time of year, I ask children who are going to go on to kindergarten, if I'm working with them and doing an assessment, I ask them to copy 3 shapes: a plus, a V, and a square. So if you have that child that's age eligible next year, just take a piece of paper, make a plus, make a V, and make a square, and see what your child does as they look at that shape and as they copy it. Now, what I do with parents and children at this age is, if I see a child is struggling a little bit, and not all children are interested in pencils and crayons and writing at this point, what I do is I take a cookie sheet and I put salt or rice in that cookie sheet. And then I have children just look around the environment and find, where do you see something that looks like this? Where do you see something that looks like that? And you can see them in windows, you see them in wallpaper design all over your house. Where do you see a square? And let's use our fingers to teach our brain, what does that feel like to cross that midpoint? What does it feel like to come down and go up? What does it feel like to go like this? In about 3 months or so, I will begin to then look at scissors with children, just to see, because I know that is a self-help skill. Once you're in kindergarten, you don't have time to wait till the teacher comes and cuts it out for you. You're expected to be able to do that. I will look to see how children use the scissors. How do they hold a piece of paper, and what do they do? First, just snipping, then they begin to go up a line, and then they begin to make the curves with the scissors. If children aren't comfortable with that, and I know oftentimes parents are worried that scissors are going to have a little haircut right here, I say, take some kitchen tongs, put cotton balls around the room, let the child pick up the cotton balls with the kitchen tongs, it exact same motion as scissors, and yet you don't have to worry about that. But it is important that we begin to move into that direction. I'm also a big believer right now, if your child is starting to work into pencil paper, to use the smaller pencil. And that's what we call the miniature golf size pencil. You can get them at Staples, at Office Depot. We're finding, and there is a program out there called Handwriting Without Tears, that is a big believer also in the smaller pencil, that when a child has a smaller pencil to work with and doesn't have to worry about the weight of the longer pencil with the eraser, that it's very hard to get that fist grasp around that smaller pencil. The children will gravitate to holding it with what we call the efficient grasp. And that is important. The tripod grasp is what we're looking for, whether it's right hand or whether it's left hand. And we do encourage you not to try to make that determination for your child. If your child right now is still using right and left, put things in the middle and let them choose. Don't try to make a left-handed child into a right-handed child, because you're going to mess with the internal working of that child. But let them follow the lead as we look to see. Typically, children who are showing some ambidexterity, that's in place usually by 5.5. They will gravitate to the dominant side. Well, as we look at this whole area that we call the cerebellum, we know that the back part of the brain is called the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is where we process what we see. And so one of the words or pairs of words that I want you to use with your children, and should be using with your children, is, how do things look the same and how do things look different? Children right now, many of them are still maybe having some reversals. M's look like W's, S's go backwards sometimes if it's in their name. B's and D's get mixed up, P's and Q's get mixed up. And there's a piece in that part of that occipital lobe that has to develop to a certain point where it will turn and allow the child to sort that through. And that's typically in place by around 6 to 6.5. But we can do lots of things that helps develop, first of all, what we call visual discrimination. Again, if I look at 4 animals, can I find 2 that look the same? If I look at shapes, can I match the shapes? Even if I can't name the shape, can I match the shape? If I look at a number and I look across the row, can I find where the numbers are the same? Again, not necessarily at this point in time naming letters and numbers, it's matching, seeing what looks the same, seeing what looks different. If I start, and this is a time I start with what we call gradation in size, where I have 5 little circles from small to large, and I will demonstrate to the child, I'm going to lay these down. I'm going to put the small one here, and look how each one gets a little bit bigger till I get to the big one. Now I'm going to mix them up, and I want you to put them down the way I had them, from small to large. That becomes very, very important as the child moves, first of all, into alphabet, eventually into reading, and eventually into math. To have that whole concept of same, different, small to large, gradation in size. Puzzles are a great way to help build that. Lots of different activities that we have that can help build that what we call discrimination skills. In that same part of the brain, we have something called visual memory. What do I do when I look at something and I have to remember it? And so we know that visual memory is what eventually helps that child move into good spelling skills, good comprehension skills. But right now, it's just having the attention span, so to speak, to remember, what do 3 things look like? So if I take 3 color cards and I say, first this color, then this color, then this color, and I mix them up, can the child put them back down in the same order? If I do that with cards that have different animals on them, can they put them in the same order? Can they do that if I take 5 little blocks and I build 3 on the bottom, 2 on the top, and then I let the child look at the model, then reproduce it? If I take 6 toys, have the child name the toys, and then I cover them up, can they remember 4 of the 6 toys? One of the things that we began to see, about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, was a little bit of a decline in children in this area. And as we began to see that decline, first those of us in research, we thought it was a fluke. And then we began to see that people across the country, when I was going to professional organizations, everybody was talking about the decline in visual memory. And we began to say, let's ask parents to be real honest with us, and let's see if there's any correlation by how much screen time a child is sitting in front of a screen and perhaps the decline. And what we found was, when we began to probe that way, we were finding that children were beginning to spend, and parents were pretty honest with this, they were spending 3 to 4 hours a day in front of a screen. And what we found when we began to look at that and talk to specialists that specialize in that whole visual processing area, that in fact, and here we are in a pandemic where our children are on screens, we've got to be careful that once they're off, that we don't use that as a reinforcement tool. Children decline in this very important area. So in reality, most pediatricians would agree with us on this. We've worked with the National Association of Pediatricians. Children at this age don't need to be on a screen more than an hour a day. You're pushing it as you move towards 2 hours. Children get pulled into the screen is what happens. And we think they're learning from the screen, but in fact, they become just mesmerized, particularly when it's a cartoon. They get pulled in and they're not really learning off of the screen. So I'm hoping that when you're doing your schooling, that you're still giving your children an opportunity to really work in the real world and do things, rather than just feel like they're going to learn everything off the screen, because that's not, trust me, that is not happening. And so we want to make sure that they take the direction, maybe they see their friends, they're able to do things that way, but then they move to the real world to touch, feel, see, and do. Well, as we move up to the ears, we're talking about the area right here called the temporal lobe. And as we look at the temporal lobe, and as we begin to talk about what do I do with what I hear, again, we divide that 2 ways. We talk about auditory discrimination and auditory memory. How do I hear sound and how do I discriminate sound? And so the very first sounds we learn are our environmental sounds. And there are some games out there where you can actually, I've seen it at Target, I know I've seen it at Lakeshore, it's called What's That Sound? It's a disc, It plays a sound, and then the child has to cover up the picture that goes with that sound. But I also say, when you're outside, whether you're just in your backyard or you're taking a walk, listen to the sounds in your environment. Ask the child what they hear. Now, don't be surprised when they tell you they can hear the ants crawling along the ground, and they want you to get down and hear them with you, because children can find all kinds of sounds in the environment. But that's good, because that says they're paying attention. They're listening to that sound. If you've had the child that's had a history of ear infections, or if you've had the child that's had fluid in the ear and had to have tubes put in their ears, you want to make sure, and you want to check with your pediatrician when you go for your well child checkup, that either the tubes are out, or the tubes are placed correctly, or in fact your child is associating sound and symbol. So we learn sounds in an interesting way. After we've talked about environmental sounds, when we begin to look at children, we look to see, what did they do with beginning sounds? So if I say to the child, can you say bat sat? Can they hear the difference between the bat and the s? If I say then, if they get all of those and I go to the ending sound, what's the difference if the child hears a cat and a can? Can they repeat words that have different ending sounds? And then what's happened, and here's where this push down has happened in kindergarten. It used to be that we did not teach short vowel sounds, the ah, the eh, the I, the ah, the until we got to first grade. And that has changed. What we are finding now is that in kindergarten, and right off the bat, we begin to teach the short vowel sounds. And so we have a question about a picture of the brain. There should be a thing called the Pathways to Learning. Sylvia, I don't know if you've got that sheet and you want to put that up. Let's see, I'll give you a minute to see if we can find it. Okay. Well, when we're talking about that temporal lobe and we're talking about hearing sounds, what you've got to realize that in kindergarten, if the child is not developmentally ready to hear ah, this is what can happen. I actually have seen this happen, where the teacher is teaching a lesson and they're teaching the I sound, the I sound, and they have the children in a circle and they are feeling all the things that start with that I sound. And so they send them back to their seats to fill out or copy or circle everything that has that sound. And then I've had teachers say to me, I can't believe they circled the pen, or I can't believe they circled the pet instead of the pin. And I'll say to them, oftentimes what we have found is if child is not quite ready for that medial sound, which is usually not in place much before 6.5 years of age, that child is listening to the lecture and listening to the talk and can play the games, but when it comes time to having to apply it, they're just not ready. And so what I would suggest you do is make sure that before you try to go in and get into teaching children to read, that we truly make sure that that foundational base is there in that area of auditory discrimination. Well, the other part of that, of the brain right here, is called auditory memory. What do I do when I have to listen and follow directions? And oftentimes I will have parents say to me, well, if there's going to be an area, I think it's going to be this one. Because so often children, particularly in the home setting, do something called selective listening. And they know how many times you're going to ask them to pick up the toys before you're down there on the floor picking them up as well. How many times you're going to call them to dinner before you really mean it. And so what we find is that we want to, first of all, make sure that a child truly can follow a 3-part direction at this point. So if you want to check your child's auditory memory, ask them to repeat 3 numbers, 7, 9, 3. Ask them to repeat 3 words, cat, house, shoe. Ask them to follow a 3-part direction. Hold their hands and say, I want you to touch your nose, clap your hands, then turn around. Can they listen and can they follow that 3-part direction? Then I ask them to say a sentence. The boy is going to the baseball game. We want to see, can the child hold on to that many syllables and be able to repeat back what it is you've asked them? So oftentimes when I'm in the classroom, I have to remind teachers a lot, make sure that when you're giving directions, that you don't give them in more than, depending on the age of the child, 2-part, 3-part. And as children move closer to getting ready for kindergarten, I find that most kindergarten teachers give their directions in 4 parts. So we're going to be looking eventually moving from 3 to 4 parts. And when we look at children, we want to make sure that this area is really working for them. Oftentimes you see this in children who have very short attention spans or really struggle staying on task. They just can't hold on to enough directions. And so there's a good way for you to check whether or not your child is really being able to listen and follow the direction. Well, as we move up here to this part of the brain, right up here at the top, we're going to move into something called the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is where we develop our language. And it's deep within the brain that we develop, first of all, receptive language and then expressive language. Receptive language is just understanding words, and there's a hierarchy. We first learn our nouns, then we learn our action words, then we learn our descriptive words of size and shape and color. And right now, if you have the child that's 4.5, getting ready to turn 5, your child should be into what we call position and space words. So if I gave your child a little tiny chair and a little tiny figure, and I said to them, put this on the chair, put this under the chair, put it behind the chair, put it in front of the chair, put it next to the chair, would they be able to move that into what we call the correct position? Because as we move up the ladder with words, we find that as children understand words, then they have that comfort zone of using those words and talking and expressing them. And so we want to make sure that in building this, we find that the best way to do this is with reading with your child. And reading with your child really does help them build that vocabulary. Now, what happens oftentimes is that we really say, when we're reading with the child, we'll gather up maybe 5, 6, 7 books. We're getting ready to spend 20 minutes to 30 minutes reading with our child. And you read the first book, and what does the child sometimes say to you? Read it again. And we read it again. And then you get to the end of the book, and what do they say to you again? Read it again. And you think, I don't know that I can read Brown Bear one more time. But here's what's happening. The brain is saying to the child, repeat, repeat, repeat. The brain loves repetition at this age. And so what we say to you, I love it when a child says to me, you know, I can close that book and I can read it with my eyes shut. Meaning they've heard it enough times, they know the words, they're familiar with the words, and they give it to you. And that's the way we build that receptive language, with reading with children. And it's so very, very important. I cannot stress enough how important reading with a child is, because what we want them then to do is, as they begin to get this vocabulary, they're going to use it. Now, oftentimes what children do is they want to talk to you when you're very, very busy. When we're in session in school, you may pick them up and ask them, well, how was your day? What did you do today? And they just sort of shrug their shoulders. I don't know. But when you get home and you're busy doing something, then they want to talk about what their day was like or how it was. I want you to find a time where you can say to your child, you know what, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear what questions you have. And that means cell phones have got to be off. They've got to be away from you. The iPads, all those things that would take you away from being totally with your child should be away. And this is the time you have with your child. One of the things that we look at when we look at expressive language is we look to see, first of all, articulation. We know that there's a rule of thumb that by age 3, a child should be understood 50% of the time. By age 4, that's 70% of the time. And by age 5, that's 90% of the time. So we want to make sure that if your child, and you would know this best, is having trouble articulating, they're not using their words correctly, maybe people have said to you, maybe relatives have said to you, I don't understand them when they speak, because as parents, we get used to their nuances of language and their pointing and all of the things that they are going to communicate to us. But If somebody else says to you, I don't understand, you can be sure that when your child is with their peer group, if the peer group doesn't understand, they're going to tell them, I didn't understand what you said. What did you say? And they're going to ask others. And I've seen many a child sort of pull in around the age of 5 if they feel they're not being understood. So if in fact your child might benefit for some speech therapy, I know schools are having to do everything virtually right now, but that will be changing. And the school districts are required to offer services at no charge starting at age 3. If you feel that maybe your child doesn't qualify because they look at 7% and below, then what we would say to you is ask your insurance to see if they cover a private provider that could even give you some ideas at home. Like one of the first things I say to parents is, as children are developing speech, make sure that they're chewing on crackers so they can get that saliva going. Make sure when you're outside, you're blowing bubbles so you get that air out of the diaphragm and you get what that feels like to blow those bubbles. Because I want children to begin to use as much of their pieces of their face and their structure to be able to make those sounds. And some of those things work very, very nicely in developing. I also sometimes, if the child doesn't have an allergy, I'll put pudding around their lips, or I suggest parents do, or ice cream right here. Get that tongue moving. I say to the parents, give your child a little mirror. Tell them the only time they can stick out their tongue is when they're looking at the mirror. But stretching that tongue, getting that tongue out there and wiggling that tongue around really helps when we begin to work with that whole piece of speech. And of course, there are some sounds like the TH and the SH and the WH we don't worry about, because the minute we get them in, they lose their 2 front teeth and out they go again. So we want to make sure that if we're working on sounds, we're working on sounds that are very age appropriate for your child and helping them to express their language. Well, as we come up here to this front part of the brain, right up here, where it's something called the parietal lobe. And this happens usually starting at about 4.5 to 5. We're right about here. As we move down here, we're going to get here at about 6 to 6.5. And what has been happening is the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain are being brought together by a band of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. It starts at the back and it moves all the way up here to the front. As it pulls the right side and the left side together, that allows for cross communication across the lobes of the brain. And that all helps us get into what we call abstract learning. At this age, children, as I said, are very concrete. I learned the hard way that if I say to a child, I want you to pick up your foot, and that's all I say, I better be prepared that the child is going to lean down and pick up their foot and hold on to their foot, because I said, pick up your foot, when actually what I meant is just stand there and hold your foot up. But children will follow your direction, and again, they're very concrete. But as we probe this area, we want to say, is this beginning to develop the way it should? And so if I'm working with a child and I have a game book and I have lots of toys that we play with, I would say to the child, I'm going to close my game book and I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to think about the answer. And oftentimes children will even go like this, okay, I'm thinking, because they know right where they have to go to get these answers. And I'll say to them, which is the bigger number? Is it 3 or is it 7? Which is taller, a tree or a flower? Which is smaller, a horse or a dog? Which weighs the most, an elephant or a mouse? And then I'll say to them, I'm going to say a sentence. I'm going to leave out a word, and I want you to put the word in for me. Fire is hot, ice is, a rabbit is fast, a turtle is, sister is a girl, brother is a, the moon shines at night, the sun shines in the. And these are what we call opposite analogies. We have to think about this. We just don't have something we can point to. And then I'll say to them, let's think about animals for a minute. Farm animals, zoo animals. Can you name some animals for me? How many children can name 4 to 5 different animals in a category? Many children who this area is just developing, they'll say, well, there's dogs and there's cats and there's elephants and there's dogs and there's cats and there's elephants. And oh yeah, guess what? There's dogs and there's cats and there's elephants, and they'll repeat the same over and over again. What we're looking for is the differences within categories, whether it's food or whether it's colors or whether it's, as I used, animals. And then I'll say to the child, I want you to think about dogs and cats for a minute. Dogs and cats both have a nose. What else do they have that would be the same? How are they different? And there's those words again, same and different, and why they're so very, very important. Well, as we take a look at the entire brain and see where the child is developing, we can actually start at birth. There are milestones that we hit all the way through. I personally can take a child all the way up to 18 years of age, looking to see where they fall. At this point in time, getting ready for kindergarten, I do not look at what I call academic achievement. If I know that the brain is developing the way it should develop, and if I know the child is going to start school with a certain developmental level, which I'll talk about here in a minute, I know that when it comes time to learning the alphabet and learning those words, it's going to happen appropriately. I don't need to rush it. I don't need to try to overpower and move before the child is ready for the entire brain to develop. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Last year, I had a woman come in my office with her little boy. And this little boy had a September, I think it was September 15th birthday. And she said to me, I want that piece of paper that says my child is ready to start kindergarten. And I looked down at her permission note and I said to her, I said, oh my gosh, his name was Joshua, by the way. He misses the cutoff date. How lucky for Joshua. He gets an extra year to grow and to play and to have fun. And she said, oh no, Joshua is reading and I want him to start kindergarten, but they tell me they won't let him start unless I get that piece of paper from you. And so she, before we even had a chance to do very much, she pulled out a little book and she said, here, read this to the lady. I was the lady. And so Joshua sat down and sure enough, this is what he read. He said, the dog is black and white. The dog likes to play. The dog plays in the grass. The dog plays in the green grass. And it was one of those little books where every sentence builds on another word. And then he closed the book and he smiled at his mom, and mom said, see, I told you he can read. And I said, yes, he read those words, and I'd like to now ask Joshua a question. I said, Joshua, what color was the dog? And no more than 20 seconds had passed by through from the time he'd finished reading the 5 sentences to now I'm asking the question. And Joshua's response to me was, what dog? And mom goes, what do you mean, what dog? You just read about the dog, you know. But what had happened here, and I've seen this over and over, is Joshua had memorized words, but they didn't have any meaning really. They didn't sink in as to what it was all about. And after I said, let's let Joshua play a little bit, and let's talk about this whole area of readiness. And when I did ask him if he would pick up a pencil, because I was going to ask him to do something, he just looked at me and he said, I hate to write. We didn't even get in that area. I said to mom, I said, you know, what's happened here is that somehow Joshua has memorized the words. And she said to me, no, not somehow. I've been spending all the last about 3 to 4 months just pasting words all over the house. And Joshua has to read those words every night before he's allowed to get a treat. And I said to her, I said, I don't want to talk about child abuse here, but in reality, Joshua's, you know, really truly was pleasing you by memorizing words and how smart he is that he could do that. But in terms of putting it together for comprehension, it was not working. And I have seen that over and over and over again. And so as we look at this whole piece of the brain, there's another very important piece to how children grow, and that's what we call social emotional maturity and attention span. And as I said in the beginning, one of the things I look at, and I'm very quick to say to a parent, if your child may have all of the skills, but if they still socially and emotionally need time to grow, I would give the time. Because we want to see what the child is doing in terms of how they're interacting with their peers and how are they confident in what they feel like they can do. And do they show that interest? Are they eager to learn a new task? And are they separating from you, the parent? Now, I know what's happening now, and we're seeing it more and more, is the children have regressed a little bit in separation. I've seen where children who were separating are not separating, but we have to recognize that children have been through an awful lot in terms of being at home, not having their peers to play with, not building those social networks that is very important at this particular age. And so we can't discount that there have been some things that have been happening over these last almost year now, last March. And so I have had some educators, I know this isn't going to happen, but I will tell you, I have been in many Zoom meetings where many educators across the country just think we ought to just scrap this year and give every child wherever they were before it happened, let them do that grade again, or spend more time at preschool if necessary, or in their play group. Because what we find is that eventually, if the catch up doesn't happen, children are going to fall behind. What I find and how I look at this is, if a parent comes to me and says, I plan to go to public school next year and I want to know if my child is ready, then I would like to see the child when they start school looking like, and this is to meet the benchmarks that California has set for kindergarten now. I'd like to see the child start school between 5 to 5.5 in the developmental age. That means that's not their chronological age. Their chronological age is just their birth date, the day they were born. If you have a child that was born 6 months or more prematurely, then I say you go to the date they were due, you add 6 weeks because they were developing outside the womb, and that will give you what I call an adjusted birth date. Don't be afraid if you know, and most parents do know more so than anybody, if you think your child might benefit from what we call the gift of time, that bonus year. I find that if children get the opportunity to spend an extra year in preschool, some children get to go to TK, you're going to find that there is quite a difference between a child who's just turning 5, particularly in those summer months, to those children who are turning 6 in September, October, November. And kindergarten teachers tell me that as well. But now that the state has adopted these new formats that they have to learn at a certain point in time to move forward, I'm finding more and more kindergarten teachers are saying to me that they are making more recommendations to spend another year in kindergarten. Well, that might sound fine if you think, well, let's give it a try. We'll just go, and if it doesn't work, we'll spend another year there. But you see, once you start school and you develop those kinds of relationships, particularly at that 5-year-old level, when your friends move on to the next classroom and you have to stay behind in kindergarten, that's called a retention. And that has a whole different connotation to a child than getting to spend another year in a preschool setting getting to play. So anybody that knows me and knows what I've done, I do a lot of longitudinal studies to see what happens to those children that do get that gift of time. Where are they in kindergarten? And then I look again at a random sample in 3rd grade. I look again at 6th grade in middle school, and then I look in high school. And I wish I could take every parent to my senior exit interviews where I actually invite the parents, but I tell the parents this is the time they cannot talk. It's the students going to tell me what it was like going through school. Many students who were given that bonus year way back when will say to me, I didn't even know I had a bonus year. Did I have a bonus year? Because it just became part of who they were going through school. Yet the child who was retained in 3rd grade will tell me very quickly that was an unsettling experience being retained in 3rd grade, and they remember it all the way up even into being 18. And they will say to me, that may have been the best thing that happened, but boy, I remember when I was told I was going to have to spend another year in 3rd grade. And the sad part is that oftentimes that's where it shows up the most. Everybody wants to give the grace of time and say, well, let's try another year. Well, we'll try one more year. And before you know it, and I'm now 7 or 8, I'm in 3rd grade, and I just didn't make it. And so what I say to parents is, take a look at where your child is developmentally. Know where they are in terms of their range of development, understanding that all children grow at different rates and different time. I know schools will tell you, oh, we'll meet their needs wherever they are. And we talk about the universal design for learning. You'll hear that a lot. If you're going to a private school, for most private schools that we work with in Los Angeles, as well as here in Orange County, it's a non-issue. They tell the parent where they want the child to be, and you either are there or you don't get in. And they are looking usually about 3 months higher. They want the child starting their kindergartens usually at about 5 years, 9 months, which means regardless of where you are right now, you've got so much time to get to those developmental levels. And again, it's not about how many words you've memorized or how many colors you know or how many shapes or how far you can count. That part can be rote memory. It's about the whole child, how they are processing information for the whole piece of development. And so it won't surprise you when I say that I'm a big believer that if a child needs the gift of time, we give it when it's best going to be the most useful, which is now. We don't want to prune away any of the dendrites that are happening in the brain. We want them all to be there to be developed. And so I will also address, I also have some parents that talk to me about, being bilingual. I wish we could all have more than one language to speak. Oftentimes when we look at children who are developing their language skills, I like to make sure that the child is at a certain level in their speaking. And we know that oftentimes that if the parent is speaking in home, their native language, that becomes their primary language. Through the process of play, the child will pick up the English language. It's when we try to force through some type of a mechanism that they've got to be forced into a language that we sometimes run into problems. So I say, let the child have that opportunity to play. Let's watch how that language develops. But if you want that child to truly have the two languages, then the language that is your primary language is what will be spoken in the house. And so I want to make sure, as I look at the time here, I don't want to overspeak my time, but I do want to answer your questions. Some of you are concerned, I see it in chat, about the handouts. Sylvia has those, and she's going to make everything available to you. Is that right, Sylvia? Okay, good. So you will get all of the handouts that I've been referring to you this evening as we've talked. And I do want to, you can either type it or you can just ask me, but I do want to be able to answer your questions that you might have about development, or about anything that we've been talking about. And so I'll open it up. Do any of you have any questions?
You can just unmute yourself if you're ready for a question.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I was wondering what you think about the Montessori method and introducing it at a certain age. Is there a certain developmental age that is too young to go into that kind of learning?
Well, I'm very familiar with Montessori. I actually teach the child development part at UCI to people who are in training in the Montessori program. They have a Montessori training program there. What you have to realize in Montessori is that the age ranges are very, very different. So that they have what they call a primary, which actually is a 3 to 5-year-old. And what they do is they present the material, and then they have materials where the child can go and take the material, and if they're using them appropriately. What I watch very carefully for the child who will be successful in Montessori is not the child that just goes, takes the materials, puts them on their mat, and then puts them back and folds up the mat, then moves to something else. And I've seen that happen, particularly children who might be struggling with any kind of attention span. In terms of learning, I find that children can learn just as well in any kind of a program. Montessori is a little more direct in terms of how they build their skills, and they introduce them through the mat work. But in terms of when I measure development, I find that development is just the same whether I'm working in a developmental preschool or whether I'm working in a Montessori. Is the child the right fit for the type of work? Because there's a lot of independent work in the Montessori program. The teacher introduces the concept, and then the child is to go practice the concept. And so the child has to be pretty self-directed to be successful in that type of a program.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Our daughter is definitely on the younger side for starting kindergarten. So she turns 5 August 21st.
Very
You know, do you think that well, she's going to be going to public school? Um, you know, I would assume she's ready, but, you know, hearing you go through all this checklist, I'm kind of thinking, oh, geez, like, is this something where we can really evaluate it ourselves? Do we need to bring her in to get her evaluated? Like, you know, someone who's really close to that cutoff, how would you recommend we proceed?
Well, what I would first of all recommend is that you talk to Sylvia and just get her opinion if she's been watching her. I would, you know your child best of all. If you want to just have a real quick checklist, go on our website, and
Mhm.
there's a place there on the first page that has something called permission note, and just pull it up for yourself, because what we do is we have a list of behaviors. There's 19 of them listed, and you, the parent, would say, I usually see this behavior, I sometimes see this behavior, I rarely see this behavior. And then see whether it's a church person or somebody that knows your child in a different setting could fill
Mhm.
out also that portion of it. And if you find right now at this time that out of those 19, you're finding more S's, which is about 7 or 8 S's than you are usually, then I would say you probably right now are looking more at a child that would benefit with that birthday as being older rather than the youngest. In public school, definitely, there's no way you can get around it. She will be the youngest. Depending on your district, some districts will only honor that September 1 birthday, but depending again, a lot of it has to do with the superintendent, whether or not they will allow you to have that gift of time. They do not,
Mhm.
because of the funding mechanism, they do not have to put her into the TK program. The TK program is designed by, I personally think they went the wrong way on the calendar on TK, but that they went with the September, October, November, who naturally were going to be older anyway. Pretty much it is our June, July, August children. If you see the skills that I just talked about, if you think they're there, take very close attention to what she does with paper and pencil. Is she happy doing those kinds of copying tasks? Is she drawing a picture of herself? Is she learning to write her name?
Mhm.
Because you're going to see that that will make all the difference.
Thank you.
Okay, I do have this question to everybody. Can you all hear me now? Somebody said my volume dropped. Can you hear me? Okay. My daughter turns 5 in October, and she hasn't been able to attend La Playa yet because of COVID. She has never really been away from me. I'm worried about her transition to TK, never having been to preschool in person. What is your opinion on staying in preschool another year versus going to TK, or are they equivalent? That's a very good question. I happened to be in Sacramento the night that the TK was developed and the night that Schwarzenegger signed into law the changing of the cutoff date. And so what we found was that originally the thought was that the TK would have no more than 20 to 1, 20 students to a teacher. But what has happened is that we're now seeing that most TKs are up to the size that the teachers union has agreed upon, which is typically 30 to 33 students. That's too many children at that age to be in a class. The state is very specific about certain ages in preschool. You have to have a 12 to 1 ratio, 12 children to one teacher. And so what I find is that if we're not careful, we're not doing what needed to be done in TK. So I don't know your TK, but I would pay very close attention to the class size. And if they stretch that to over 18, then I would say stay in preschool. The results are the same. It's the fact that the child is going to be older, they're going to be exposed the same way. Don't go into a TK. Some districts, how they accommodated it, and the reason they did it this way, because they didn't think TK was here to stay. It's here to stay. What they did was they made it a TK kindergarten. So they put the child in kindergarten with the idea that everybody knows this is a TK year. Well, what I find is, again, when it gets time for the kindergarten children to move on, the child who's actually in there for TK really begins to question, well, why can't I do what they're doing? And so I am not a big believer in that type of a multi-graded program, the way they're using it. I've seen multi-age work, but not like that. So I would say know your TK in the school you're supposed to go to, ask about the class size, and if it gets over what would be a responsible class size, which is at the 5-year level considered 18-1, then I would say no, stay where you are. Any other questions? I am more than happy to give you my personal email. And if you do have questions, that you could feel free just to email me the question. And someone is saying to everybody that Los Angeles Unified School District has 24 students, and some schools do have a mixed KTK if enrollment numbers make sense for that. It's I hate to say it, but it's all about the dollar. And they have to make it work in terms of, and the other piece is the teachers union and to how many students they feel will work in the classroom to make that all happen. So this is where you, the parent, you need to know that in California, kindergarten is not required, TK is not required. You literally can keep a child at home and just enter first grade if you so choose to do that. We in California do not have what's called compulsory kindergarten education laws. Now, on the other hand, most parents do use kindergarten, and I'm a strong believer in the kindergarten year, but you need to know that that's not something anybody's going to come looking for your child, because it is not required. It says you mentioned reading in kids, remembering and repetition. Are there certain books you recommend to help them comprehend? When you're at first, I love books that, obviously we start out with the picture books, and then I like books that do a lot with rhyming words. I like books that have good pictures and good stories, and there's a lot of good book lists that we can provide for you instead of going out book by book. I just don't try to get into too many words and not enough pictures. And so the books like the Bob books, as children are starting to begin to read and starting to sound out some of the words, are good for getting that repetition of sound and that repetition of putting sound and symbol together. But there are some, really, really good children's books now, and you can check, all the book awards that come out. And I'd be happy to provide a list to you without going at book by book. But you want to find something that really is going to draw the interest to the child. If your child still enjoys those picture books and wants to talk about that, make up the stories. Let them make up a story about the pictures. Talk about what the pictures have. It's the use of language, getting those words to be used over and over again, that really make the difference. And so that's the kind of thing I would do. It says here, we were at 25 students in TK and at 27 at K, even though those are over the limits. And it was, again, and that's Maria, it was too much. What happens is children at this age need attention, and they need somebody that really is going to watch and make sure that they just don't kind of follow the masses. And that's my biggest concern when I visit the classroom. I try to, before the pandemic, I tried to get into a classroom every week just to see how it is working within the TK classroom, in the kindergarten classroom, how's that transition. I work with school districts all the time in talking about the transitional piece that needs to happen, so that we make sure that when the child starts kindergarten, we really do have that foundation that's going to be necessary to take them the rest of the way through school. That's what's important here. I don't worry that we won't meet the needs of children. Most of you, if you're involved in the school district, you know that by the time you get to high school, you can earn college credit. You can graduate with 2 years of college now with advanced placement coursework. Your children's needs will be met, but you've got to look at the whole child. You've got to make sure that that child's got that foundation for what's to come and what's ahead. Many countries use what's called that gap year. When they graduate, they get that year to do and to grow and to mature. We don't do that here. I know some people do themselves take a gap year, and now that we've moved insurance where children can stay on insurance longer, you might begin to see more of that. But I would rather, if we're going to talk gap years or building in time, I'd rather do it at the beginning, so that when the child goes through, I want that child, I'm not looking for straight A's here, I'm looking for success in curriculum. And that's the key, because most kindergarten classrooms do have what is considered success in the curriculum. And it's based on the state standards that have now been passed. We never used to have state standards in kindergarten, but we do now. My email, thank you for asking. I said I would share it. It's very simple. It's just Bonnie Bruce, all lowercase, BONNIE BRUCE @iCloud.com. Sometimes due to my schedule, it might take a day or two for me to get back to you, but know that I will do that if you do. And if you do need to talk, if you have a call that you'd like to just talk about your child or some concerns you might have, my phone number that you can reach me at, this would take you to my private line and you wouldn't have to go through the office number, is 714-328-9137. And we can talk about how you see your child, how you can look at, maybe I went quickly through something and you'd like to have it reinforced, how you look at readiness in that area.
Bonnie, I have a question.
Okay.
Also, this has been extremely helpful. You know so much, and I just want to soak up everything. It's been very helpful, and thank you so much. You spoke a little bit about how this unusual year has caused a little bit of separation regression, and we are definitely seeing that with our 4-year-old. She has a lot of separation anxiety, even if I go for a walk around the block.
Right.
Do you have any recommendations for those of us who are seeing things like that about how to maybe help with that during this transition that's coming forward?
Right. Well, I'm going to put a little bit this back to the parent in terms of communicating with the child. This is not the time to discipline the child over the separation. It's very, very real what they're feeling. They're scared. They've sensed a difference in the home. Different parents have reacted differently to this. And we're very much aware of that. Many parents are working from home themselves and trying to schedule and put it all together. What we try to do is say to the child, you know, what can I do that might help you and make you feel good? And one of the things that I have found works really well is, and I don't know how many of you have seen the book, The Kissing Hand. It's about a little raccoon. Okay. And you give the child a kiss on the palm of their hand, and you just say to them, whenever you're missing me, whenever you think about me, instead of being sad, just put your hand right on your face and you'll know that I'm there with you. I'm thinking about you. And it's been amazing that everybody really has said that that type of, just that little suggestion. Sometimes I will say that maybe if the child has something you can even attach inside their clothing, maybe it's just something that would remind them of you, that you can do that, just so that they know that you're thinking of them and you're there with them, and that will help. But the biggest thing is just letting children talk about it, getting able to really say why they feel that way, how they feel, without you trying to say, well, you can't feel that way, or you shouldn't do that, or you letting them be real honest with you and say, you know, I've had those, and be honest with them here. I've had those feelings too sometimes. Sometimes I get scared and I don't want to do that, but I wouldn't, you know, I know you're going to have a fun time wherever you're going. I know that this will, and we're going to have to build that back in. And when you start coming back together, you're going to have to spend a little bit of time realizing that that separation piece is there. I'm kind of a big believer in it. Now, you all, I don't know, do you with a parent participation, your parents are there sometimes and sometimes they're not, right? They all take turns helping out. At least that's how most people just,
they probably won't be in the classroom for a while because of COVID,
right.
but usually we have parent volunteers, so our kids are used to having their parents around school too.
Right. So that's going to be a little bit different, because in some ways, if it's not when you go back and it's not your turn to be the parent in and some other parent is there, you know, you have to say to your child and show them, get a calendar. My turn is here, and show them when it will be your turn to be there. But I have found, of all the things that I have tried to research what works the best, I have found that kiss on that hand, and get that book, The Kissing Hand, It really, really does get the child to talk about that as well. Anything else?
Well,
I don't see
Bonnie,
any. Yes.
did anybody else have a question? No? Well, Bonnie, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. I heard you were really great, and you proved it. So I think it's really, really helpful, and thank you, especially in this time that we've got lots of big worries going on.
We do. We do.
And I like the way you're saying that we should just listen to children. I recommend this great book called The Rabbit Listened.
That's good. I love that book too.
Yeah.
Very,
Yeah.
very good.
Mhm.
Okay, well, if I don't see any more questions, I want to thank you for inviting me to come to your group this evening. And I wish you all the very, very best. And hopefully we're going to get through this together type of thing. But just remember, these children are small, they're young, but they've got very deep feelings, and we need to understand that as well. So I thank you, and I'm going to go ahead and go off now.
Thank you. Good night,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bonnie. It was wonderful.
My pleasure.